Well, the struggling middle class keeps getting punched in the gut with job losses and higher prices, even though the Fed says we need some more inflation. But do we really? Rich, isn't inflation a lot worse than what the government's letting on, particularly for the middle class?
Well, sure, and below the middle class, it's even worse because that's, basic supplies like food and so forth inflate at a higher level than do discretionary items, particularly technology items, which tend to come down in price. So the poorer middle class end up paying a lot more. They're paying for this cheap dollar. So,
Cheryl, the Fed is actually doing more to make life tough for the lower rung than anybody else.
Correct. And let's not forget the wage situation. We just got that big jobs report last week. And if you look at wage growth and you add it in, if you combine it with inflation, right, we haven't seen anybody get a pay raise since 2005. We're living the same way we were living in 2005 on a dollar per dollar basis. That's not going to cut it in 2015. That's 10 years later.
And Sabrina, the IMF just came out with a report today saying, get used to it. We can't expect any improvement in living standards for decades to come.
Yeah, and I was going to add to what Cheryl just said, that wages may have inched up just very slightly, but hours were contracted. Yeah. So it means, even less than it would have otherwise. And I think that some of the regulations that we're seeing, again, here in Washington are making things like buying regular household goods and food more expensive. But having a free society means that you have to have affordable goods and services. And that's something that we are finding is more and more difficult for average Americans.
Our colleague on Forbes on Fox, John Tamny, just came out with a book. I want to give him a plug, which says that we can snap back in no time if we have the right policy. So I think the IMF grim assessment is much. Meanwhile, folks, after years of the government telling us that we eat way too much salt, well, now a lot of researchers claim salt is actually good for you. So should we buy into anything the government tells us about our health? Cheryl, I just want to quote what one of the researchers, and this is a woman of great importance. She's the former president of the American Heart Association. She said the current salt guidelines are based on almost nothing. Some people really want to hang on to this belief system on salt, but they are ignoring the evidence. So do we believe anything the government comes out with?
Well, look, let's go back to the word guidelines, for instance. These different bodies, the American Heart Association and the government, are arguing over milligrams of salt. The average salt we should have per day is a teaspoon of salt. That's what the government says. There's a few milligrams less, a few milligrams more. That's what we're arguing about here as far as salt goes. But yeah, I will take the guidelines from the government as far as healthy living, because salt and blood pressure, you can't ignore that correlation.
Hold on a second, Cheryl, because I read some of the reports leading up to this, and there are big differences. What the government used to recommend and what a lot of people now saying is necessary are very different. There's a very wide divide between the two.
Yeah, I think this just comes down to common sense. If you avoid junk food, you avoid a lot of excess salt. So avoid junk food and happily salt whatever is left.
Well, Sabrina, should we avoid advice from the government on our health?
Yes, that's what's settled here. The science on salt is not settled, but IWF has a whole program about the culture of alarmism, and this is part of it. And the thing that bothers me about this report is that the government uses these studies and it uses fear to then initiate new regulations, which drive up the cost of goods. It makes living more difficult, makes us less free as a society. All of this is very bad, and I wish the government would get out of the way.
Cheryl, it makes you wonder, in the era of Obamacare, where the government's getting more involved in our health care.
Sure. Gosh, because it's going to cost them. Why do you think that so many American corporations now have gyms and Weight Watchers meetings internally? Because they want their employees to stay healthy so they don't end up at the doctor facing a heart attack or a stroke, which I'm sorry, those are horrible things in your life, but it's also a very costly thing when it comes to your health insurance.
No, it makes good business sense to keep people healthy. Let's just not take advice from the government to do that. Rich Karlgaard, Sabrina Schaefer, Cheryl Casoni. Don't forget, by the way, you can catch Rich and Sabrina and myself, by the way, on Forbes on Fox every Saturday, 11 a.m. Eastern Time. That's on our sister network, the Fox News Channel. Liz?